The Curtiss-Wright XP-55 Ascender might look like an upside-down mistake at first glance, but its story reveals a determined quest for innovation under the pressures of World War II. Alright, let's dive in. Now, the story of the XP-55 Ascender begins against the backdrop of a rapidly changing world. Europe was descending into conflict, and the United States watched with concern. American military planners realized that a new type of fighter might be necessary to face emerging threats from Germany and Japan. The standard designs of the day, single-engine fighters like the P-40 Warhawk, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang, were all quickly evolving, but the Army Air Corps recognized that radical thinking could yield a game-changer. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal R-40C. Now, this was more than just a simple invitation. It was practically a clarion call for the most daring aerodynamic ideas. The Army wanted a fighter that exceeded the performance and capabilities of anything currently flying or on the drawing boards. Speed, maneuverability, range, firepower, all of them were on the wish list. But the most telling aspect was the Army's openness to unorthodox designs. They weren't just tolerating unusual ideas, they were actively encouraging them. This was a unique environment that allowed the XP-55 to germinate. Over 50 submissions arrived in response, reflecting an entire industry buzzing with proposals, some ordinary and some, oh boy, truly off the wall. Curtiss-Wright's concept caught the eye because it defined conventional wisdom. It had a pusher propeller at the tail, forward canards, and no traditional tailplane. Remember, this was a time when the tried and true formula for fighters involved a powerful front-mounted engine and a tail behind a standard set of wings. It was nearly heretical to put the engine behind the pilot and push the aircraft forward, yet the Army was still intrigued enough to name Curtiss-Wright among 4 finalists. Once Curtiss-Wright advanced to the next phase, the Army provided funds to build a full-scale model in 1940. This was a major vote of confidence. Funding from the government meant that Curtiss-Wright had the resources to go just beyond mere sketches and wind tunnel testing. They could fabricate actual components and begin flight simulations. By 1941, the testing of scale models had begun, but the real test would come later, when a full-size prototype would take to the skies. The climate of the time made it an especially bold endeavor. The American aircraft industry was ramping up production, focusing on tried-and-true platforms for immediate service. Experimental designs often found themselves sidelined because resources had to be directed toward mass-producing proven fighters for the war effort. This was because, partly, that the Army Air Corps was still holding out hope that a technological leap could arrive just in time to catch the Axis powers off guard. If the XP-55 had delivered on its lofty promises, it might have become America's new frontline fighter. Curtiss-Wright, already a major name in aviation, saw the Ascender as its chance to deliver something extraordinary. The company's engineers recognized that if they succeeded, they'd go down in history as the masterminds behind a radical new form of aerial combat. As such, the initial impetus behind the Ascender was not just to create another plane, but to revolutionize fighter design. The seeds of ambition had been sown. Now all that remained was to see if they would bloom into a world beater or wither under the harsh demands of reality. In that sense, the birth of the XP-55 represents a reflection of the era, when desperation and innovation went hand in hand, and a testament to the boundless ambition that sometimes grips the aviation community when war looms. Now, it was a gamble for the industry for sure, but it's one that Curtiss-Wright believed was worth taking. Now, the XP-55 Ascender's appearance alone is enough to make any aviation buff do a double take. Even at a glance, you realize that this is no ordinary aircraft. At a time when nearly every fighter had a nose-mounted engine and a tail at the back, Curtiss-Wright's design turned the formula on its head. Quite literally, the Ascender placed its inline engine behind the pilot, driving a pusher propeller that pushed the aircraft forward instead of pulling it. Now, to understand the logic, you have to appreciate the aerodynamic theories that guided its development. Designers believed that by moving the engine and propeller to the rear, the nose could be kept relatively free of obstructions, potentially reducing drag. Additionally, the forward base canard surfaces, small forewings near the nose, were intended to provide greater control and stability. The main wings were swept back in a way reminiscent of early experiments in jet aircraft, though the Ascender remained a piston-driven plane. Now, on paper, placing the propeller at the back could theoretically offer better pilot visibility. In conventional designs, the nose of the plane and the engine block could obscure the pilot's forward view. The Ascender promised an unobstructed view of the horizon, essential for a fighter pilot scanning the skies for enemy aircraft. Moreover, this arrangement hinted at improved aerodynamics, as the fuselage's profile might offer a sleeker path through the air. However, the design came with its share of challenges. Traditional aircraft relied on horizontal stabilizers at the tail for pitch stability. The Ascender replaced this typical tail with a pair of canards at the front, which made the plane a true tail-first design. This reversed approach was complicated by the need to keep the propeller safely away from the pilot. Obviously, you wouldn't want the canopy or cockpit structure interfering with the fast-spinning prop just behind the seat. Now, engine cooling became another puzzle. The Allison V1710 engine, a commonly used power plant in many American fighters, required sufficient airflow. In a conventional layout, the prop wash and forward motion could help direct cool air into the radiators. In a pusher configuration, though, engineers had to find creative ways to route air over the engine and exhaust it efficiently. Otherwise, overheating could reduce performance and reliability, especially during takeoff, climb, or idle on the ground. Now, the wings themselves also raised eyebrows. They were swept back slightly, a design feature that later became standard on early jets like the Messerschmitt Me-262 and the F-86 Sabre. But in the early 1940s, the aerodynamic science behind swept wings was still nascent, especially for prop-driven aircraft. The combination of canards, swept wings, and a pusher prop made the XP-55 a sort of Frankenstein's monster, stitching together advanced theories that had yet to be fully tested in harmony. In defense of Curtiss-Wright's engineers, they were working without aid of today's computational fluid dynamics. Wind tunnel tests could simulate some flight conditions, but real-world experience could deviate significantly from theoretical predictions. That was the gamble, and for a moment it seemed like a brand new type of fighter might indeed emerge from these daring design choices. Even the cockpit instrumentation had to be adapted. The flight controls needed to account for how the canards would move and how the center of gravity shifted compared to conventional planes. Pilots who trained on typical fighters often had to mentally recalibrate because the Ascender's response in pitch and roll was dissimilar to the standard arrangement. In some respects, it's like asking a driver accustomed to front-wheel drive to suddenly handle a rear-wheel drive car at high speeds. Well, it's not impossible, but it can be a bit of a jarring experience. Ultimately, Unconventional sums up every facet of the XP-55, from its unique shape of the airframe to the cockpit arrangement and the engine location. Nothing resembled the typical profile of a World War II fighter. It was a bold risk in the name of progress. Many believe that, if properly refined, this forward-thinking but back-engine placement approach could give rise to a new era in fighter design. Reality, of course, had other plans. Now, funding secured, and Curtiss-Wright moved full steam ahead on the Ascender program. They began by constructing scale models to test in wind tunnels, a step crucial for ironing out big aerodynamic wrinkles before committing to a full-size prototype. By 1941, these tests were well underway, offering both hopeful data and worrying signs. Engineers discovered that while the canard configuration and pusher prop showed potential in some aspects, like forward visibility and streamlined frontal areas, they posed serious stability questions that would need addressing. The real turning point came in 1943 when the first prototype, officially designated as the XP-55, rolled out. There was palpable excitement in the hangar. The first flight started off with cautious optimism. Test pilots reported that the Ascender was nimble under certain conditions and provided a surprisingly clear field of view. Onlookers who saw it taxiing were either impressed or skeptical. It definitely drew attention, with some observers joking that Curtiss-Wright had accidentally put the plane together backward. But hey, jokes aside, the euphoria, it didn't last long. During testing, engineers and pilots alike noticed that stall behavior was erratic. Stalls are a critical part of any test flight regimen because a fighter may need to maneuver aggressively in combat, possibly risking aerodynamic stalls. The XP-55, with its canard and pusher configuration, behaved differently than anything in a pilot's experience. The control surfaces sometimes struggled to regain lift once the plane entered a stall. Then came a heart-stopping moment. During a 1943 stall test, the XP-55 flipped out of control and crashed. The pilot was forced to bail out, fortunately surviving. The incident spelled trouble for the program. Although crashes during prototype testing, it's not unheard of, but new concepts often push the boundaries of known flight envelopes, and this one highlighted fundamental design flaws. Big deal. Now, investors cited a tendency to pitch violently under certain low-speed conditions, which suggested that a quick fix might not be so quick after all. Now, despite the crash, the Army and Curtiss-Wright weren't ready to abandon the project quite yet. They recognized that every experimental aircraft would have teething problems, especially one that deviated so drastically from norms. So work began on a second prototype. The design team took the lessons from the crash to modify the canards, adjusting the wing configuration just slightly and refine the tailplane arrangement. Their aim was to reduce the risk of uncontrollable stalls. By the time the second prototype flew in 1944, World War II was in full swing already. There was pressure to either prove that the XP-55 had value or just stand aside for other designs already in production. The Army wanted a fighter that could handle dogfights, ground attack, and interception duties without requiring extensive retraining or presenting undue risk to pilots. Unfortunately, the second prototype revealed additional issues, including persistent control problems and difficulties keeping the engine cool. Mechanics frequently encountered overheated components, especially in warmer weather or prolonged ground runs. The second prototype's performance did improve in some areas over the first, but the overarching question still remained. Could it catch up to or surpass the existing stable of American fighters that were already establishing their reputations in combat? The early test results suggested it struggled to achieve the speeds or the climb rates demanded of a first-rate fighter. Now, pilots also complained about the awkwardness of transitions from level flight to rapid maneuvers. Although it might have been acceptable as a specialized interceptor, the wide-ranging role the Army envisioned seemed increasingly out of reach. Development press releases from Curtiss-Wright tried to highlight the bright spots. Now, they emphasized the uniqueness of the design and the potential for growth, but behind the scenes, engineers were wrestling with a fundamental geometry problem. The Ascender was a balancing act between forward canards, swept-back wings, and a rear-mounted engine, each of which introduced complexities that weren't easily resolved. In a convention fighter, if you identified a stability issue, you might adjust the tailplane area or shift the center of gravity. In the Ascender, such changes had knock-on effects that could worsen other problems. By late 1944, the company began constructing a third prototype. This one incorporated further modifications and, importantly, armament. The Army wanted to see if this plane could carry machine guns effectively, something fundamental to a fighter's role. However, the inclusion of weaponry added weight and aerodynamic drag, influencing flight characteristics yet again. Early bench tests showed that mounting 450 caliber machine guns would be feasible, but the real question was whether the plane could handle the recoil in flight without losing that delicate balance. As the prototypes evolved, so did the mood in the hangars. Enthusiasm gave way to a more cautious attitude, tempered by the realization that the Ascender was a high-maintenance project. Still, the Army had not pulled the plug, and Curtiss-Wright continued to believe that a breakthrough still might come. Whether that breakthrough would arrive in time to see combat, or whether it was too late to save the program from an inevitable crash landing, that was becoming the pressing question. Now, a fighter aircraft that can't fight is no good to any Air Force. That's why, amid the endless design refinements and flight tests, Curtiss-Wright also focused on giving the XP-55 some teeth. After all, the Army Air Corps wanted an aircraft that could carry a reasonable load of firepower. Initial discussions centered on mounting 450 caliber Browning machine guns, which was a standard armament for many American fighters of that era. This loadout was favored for its proven reliability and respectable rate of fire, capable of shredding enemy aircraft or just strafing ground targets. The question was, where would the guns be placed? Conventional fighters usually mount guns in the wings or cowling. Now, the Ascender's engine sat at the rear, right? So that left the nose as the most logical place for the weapons. And putting them in the nose theoretically improved accuracy because the pilot wouldn't have to worry about wing-mounted convergence patterns. The possibility of a truly centered line of fire was appealing. However, structural challenges arose due to the canard layout. Installing guns in a forward fuselage that also contained canard control mechanisms, landing gear, and other equipment demanded creative engineering solutions. Adding the machine guns to the third prototype introduced another design wrinkle: recoil. Firing 450 caliber machine guns can exert a significant force. In a conventional layout, the recoil force is often absorbed along the engine mounts and the plane's frame. For the Ascender, with its rear engine, the forward fuselage had to be reinforced. This meant more weight, more complexity, and a shift in the plane's center of gravity, which was already an Achilles heel. Still, if the XP-55 could have proven stable enough and showcased a decent turn rate, it might have excelled as a short-range interceptor. Conceptually, the plane could scramble, climb quickly, and intercept enemy bombers or fighters near the front lines, leveraging its unobstructed nose for accurate gunfire. Its uniqueness might also have been a psychological asset. Enemy pilots seeing this bizarre design may have hesitated a bit, not knowing what they were up against. But in the broader strategic context of World War II, a dedicated point defense interceptor wasn't at the top of the Army Air Corps shopping list. By 1944, the Allies had taken the fight to Germany and Japan, requiring fighters that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Long range was paramount, and the XP-55 wasn't designed with that in mind. Its pusher configuration and limited internal fuel capacity made extended missions quite questionable. Close air support was another possibility. The stable forward view could theoretically let a pilot line up ground targets more easily, yet the Ascender's stall recovery issues made low-altitude operations quite risky. Imagine trying to strafe or bomb ground positions, only to find your aircraft flipping out of control at low speed. That's not a scenario that any pilot or mission planner would want to see. There's also rumors, which is more like speculative chatter in aviation circles, that Curtiss-Wright might have experimented with heavier armaments like 20mm cannons if the 50 calibers proved insufficient. Now, some American fighters, like the P-38 Lightning variants or the P-61 Black Widow Night Fighter, all carried cannons to increase destructive power, but each additional weapon would exacerbate the XP-55's weight and balance problems. If it couldn't handle 4 machine guns gracefully, how would it deal with cannons? Tactics-wise, in an alternate reality, the Ascender might have specialized in high-speed intercept missions. With its nose free of engine bulk, it had the potential for advanced targeting systems or maybe even radar. Yet, again, the technology and flight control systems of the day weren't refined enough to make this a reality in a platform as unconventional as the XP-55. One can only speculate what might have happened had Curtiss-Wright had access to digital flight control computers that could correct for the Ascender's instability. But in the actual timeline, the plane's fighting prowess remained mostly theoretical. Adding to the complexity, the Army Air Corps was also testing other radical designs. The P-59 Aerocomet, the first American jet, was already flying by 1942 and 43. Although the Aerocomet had its own shortcomings, it signaled the future where jet propulsion might supersede prop-driven fighters. The Ascender, stuck in an engineering quagmire, risked obsolescence before it could even settle on a viable tactical niche. In summary, while the XP-55 did eventually sport an arsenal of 50 caliber machine guns, the question of could it fight effectively never got a definitive and positive answer. Even in best case scenarios, the plane would have been marginally useful at specialized interception tasks, but less capable in roles that demanded maneuverability and reliability. Ultimately, no matter how intriguing the armament concept seemed, the airplane's fundamental control and stability problems overshadowed its firepower potential. Now, the Ascender's story didn't end entirely with the program's cancellation. Aviation enthusiasts and historians continued to find the design intriguing. After all, very few World War II-era fighters dared to adopt a pusher-propeller configuration. Even fewer combined with that canard surfaces and swept wings. This made the XP-55 a unique case study in aeronautical engineering, highlighting the complexities of stepping away from established design norms. Now, out of the 3 prototypes built, only one survives today, preserved at the Kalamazoo Aviation History Museum in Michigan. It stands as a tangible piece of aviation history, and visitors who encounter it often do a double take, confirming that it really is a bit backwards. The museum's example serves as a powerful reminder of the leaps of faith taken by designers during World War II. It's also a somber monument to the plane's fatal accidents, reminding viewers that pushing boundaries can come at a high cost. Technically, the Ascender contributed to the collective knowledge base in several ways. First, it proved that a rear-mounted pusher prop was not necessarily the key to performance gains. Engineers learned how to appreciate how complex airflow issues become when the propeller is placed in the back, especially regarding engine cooling and tail control surfaces. Second, the stall and spin challenges hammered home the importance of stable, predictable flight behavior in combat aircraft. One could argue that the XP-55's difficulties accelerated interest in more advanced control systems, though the real breakthroughs in that regard came with the advent of jet-age aerodynamics and eventually computerized flight controls. For Curtiss-Wright, the project was both a valuable experience and a cautionary tale. The company took a gamble, and while it didn't pay off in the form of a successful production fighter, it did provide lessons on design integration, aerodynamics, and risk management. In some ways, the Ascender's failures were just as instructive as any success story. They highlight the unpredictability of experimental designs, especially when numerous radical elements converge in one aircraft. From a historical perspective, the Ascender also underscores how quickly military requirements can shift. When the R-40C proposal came out in 1939, radical ideas were welcomed, even encouraged. But by 44 and 45, the priorities they changed pretty drastically. Proven fighters like the P-51 overshadowed everything else, and the next big leap was jet power, making an oddball pusher-prop fighter seem like a relic kind of overnight. Yet the Ascender still resonates among aviation buffs who kind of relish the what-if scenarios, right? What if the plane had been stable from the get-go? What if Curtiss-Wright had perfected the design sooner? Might it have seen limited production and found a niche role? Well, these questions remain in the realm of speculation, adding an element of mystique to the XP-55's legacy. Today, seeing that lone survivor in Kalamazoo can spark both awe and reflection. It's an aircraft that looks futuristic and archaic all at the same time. Its sleek lines and canard wings almost foreshadow the shape of certain modern jets, while its propeller in the rear is a nod to an era when engineers were still trying to figure out the best place to put an engine. And in that sense, it straddles two worlds, reminding us that progress in aviation is not always linear or predictable. Sometimes you venture down a path that leads to dead ends, but those paths can still teach you a great deal. Hey, thanks for joining us on this journey into the wild story of the Curtiss-Wright XP-55. This was a plane that dared to flip convention on its head and prove that pushing the boundaries of design can be both inspiring and perilous. We hope this video about the Ascender was helpful, or at least entertaining, in understanding one of World War II's most curious experiments. And if you love quirky aircraft and you want more deep dives, consider subscribing to our channel and stay tuned for more tales from the skies. Your support keeps this aviation adventure continuing. Safe flying, and we'll see you in the next one.